following program is presented by the Jericho Network in association with Podcast One.
PaintZen.com, your one-stop shop for all your house painting needs without ever leaving home. PaintZen takes all the stress out of getting your house or apartment painted, interior or exterior. Skip the hassle of finding and scheduling painters, waiting on contractors, or getting inconsistent work. Receive a fast, free, guaranteed quote online in just minutes at PaintZen.com. PaintZen's friendly staff will guide you through from start to finish, either on the phone or online, and offer a 100% satisfaction guarantee. Get inspiration and assistance with color selection, free swatch samples, and color consultations. And fully vetted, licensed, and insured on-demand painters can get started in as little as 48 hours. Listeners to this podcast will receive $100 off their next paint project by visiting paintzen.com/podcast and using promo code podcast. Visit PaintZen, PaintZen.com/podcast for your $100 discount today. Conditions apply. Get the job done with high quality at the right price at PaintZen.com/podcast with promo code podcast. PaintZen, the easiest way to get your home painted.
Hello and welcome. It's Thursday and you're tuned into the best in paranormal talk radio. This is Darkness Radio, Beyond the Darkness, and I'm your host, Dave Schrader. We've got an interesting show today. This one I know will be controversial. It'll certainly raise some ire. It'll also open a lot of minds, I'm guessing, as we explore this topic. It's something that's fascinated me when you look at the dogma of theology, of the Bible, history, and the stories that we're told. How are these stories conveyed to us and why? And one of the biggest enigmas involved in all of theology is Lucifer's place. There seems to be so many different aspects to the devil, to Lucifer, Satan. Who was he? Where was he? Why was he? And where is his real dominion? Is there hell? Is it here on earth? Well, we've got an interesting guest joining us for this evening. Priscilla Vogelbacher is here, and we're going to talk about her book, Hallowed Be Thy Name, Lucifer, Origins, and Revelation. And Priscilla has a unique perspective on this, and that's why I wanted to bring her on to kind of look into this. Tomorrow we'll be back with cryptids. We'll be talking freaky Florida, just the strange amount of beasties out there that want to kill us. From swamp apes, skunk apes, flying pterodactyls, megalodon sharks, giant alligators, you name it, they've got it. We're going to talk about that tomorrow with Scott Marlowe. But let's get into tonight's show now. Priscilla, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me on.
Listen, you know, I know in the PR that you sent over to us, there was one question, the frequently asked question, and I love this, and I think this is where we need to start so that we can set the parameter for our listeners as well. Do you worship Lucifer, Satan, or the devil, whatever title you want to call it?
No, I'm agnostic. I don't follow any religion. I grew up Roman Catholic. I went through the whole thing. I had First Communion. I went to catechism. I went to church till I was 18. I was raised Roman Catholic, so I do understand what it means to be religious. But I became apostate around the age of 15 because I started questioning things, and of course the Bible explains nothing. If you have real questions, it explains nothing. You gotta read other texts, read other material, because it comes from older sources, primarily Mesopotamian, and that's what I've done over the past decade and a half now.
All right. Well,
so no, I do not worship any deity.
Then why this topic? Why this title? To look into the story, the origins, the revelations of Lucifer. What drew you to this?
Well, my upbringing made me dwell on this. I didn't want to, but I had to find out who is God, who is the devil. Is there a heaven? Is there a hell? What does this mean? Because if it's true, if these stories are true as our prehistory, then I really thought I had to understand it, and now I do.
All right, but to specifically kind of engage in the research of Lucifer, that's certainly, in most people's opinion, a darker way to begin this research. What drew you to this specific aspect of the story?
Well, Lucifer is the most well-known mythic figure and simultaneously the most misunderstood. And when I started this, I didn't understand him either. And I wanted to. I felt like I had to, because he was the key to understanding everything else. And when anybody says Lucifer, Satan, the devil, it shows a misunderstanding or a lack of understanding, because when analyzed, these three concepts are separate. Only in a narrative sense are they the same. Because in the narratives, these epithets are used to describe the same being. So we have to take it as it is. And that's the exoteric explanation. From an esoteric explanation, they are separate, entirely separate. Lucifer in the Bible is only mentioned, I believe, twice. One in Isaiah, where he's named the morning star, and once at the end of Revelation, where Jesus claims he's the morning star. So Jesus is Lucifer, and that's because Lucifer is the left hand of God, Jesus is the right hand of God. They're two different hands of the same Godhead, and that's why they are the same. Now, Jesus, his temptation in the wilderness is the only example in the Bible in which the cosmic anti-God Satan is manifest. Every other instance in the Old Testament, it's an ambiguous angel appointed by Yahweh's court as court-appointed assassin or court prosecutor. That's it. That's all he is in the Old Testament. But in the New Testament, the only time he makes an appearance is the temptation in the wilderness. And when analyzed, I came to realize that what it really is not a real deity so much as Jesus' shadow self. In Jungian psychology, the shadow is the deepest core of who you are. It's the dark side of who you are. It's the side that people don't like to confront, but you have to. And that gets into the concept of enlightenment.
Okay.
So they're very different. And also, the devil, the concept of the devil, in the New Testament, it's never singular. It's only in the narratives or referring to Satan is it the devil. But what devil actually is a disease demon in ancient Mesopotamia. And it's always plural in the Gospels, the canonic Gospels. It's always devils, not the devil. So it's really just diseases.
It's diseases or it's diseased demons?
No, well, the demons, diseased demons are what it's referring to.
Okay.
And, Jesus is believed to be a member of the Essenes, and the Essenes were basically physicians. If you read the Bible, if you read the canonic Gospels, in a euhemeristic sense, which is taking myth as history, you'll find that what Jesus does is he goes around helping the poor, curing the sick, like a doctor. He was a physician.
All right. Now, we've kind of covered a different variation on a couple of these titles. What about Satan? Where does this come into play?
Right. Like I said, the only time the Satan, the cosmic anti-God, comes through is in the temptation of Christ, and that's basically a hallucination or a self-inflicted delusion after fasting for 40 days, because that's what it does to the human body. Of course, you have to survive on water, especially if you're in the desert, but that's really all it is. Now, if you take the narratives on their own, like I do with Genesis chapters 2 through 11, that's the bulk of the book, then yes, sometimes you'll see a reference to Satan or Lucifer as the devil. But only in a narrative sense should we take it as such. You can't claim to have an esoteric interpretation and equate those three together.
What of the serpent in the Garden of Eden? I mean, is that something that you feel takes the form of Satan, or is this a different, or is that one of the diseased demons?
No, that is Satan. And that's because in the Apocalypse of Moses, it explicitly describes him as a dragon being, actually. The Hebrew word in the Old Testament to describe the serpent, or used for the serpent, is nachash. And as a noun, it means serpent, which is where we get that. As a verb, it means diviner. And as an adjective, it means the shining one, which, of course, is a reference to Lucifer as the light bearer. So, yes, it is Lucifer or Satan.
That's always been part that confused me. If this is such an evil being, why does it take this visage of light, this visage of leadership and strength? I would think that the diseased aspect of what the Bible is trying to sell us and tell us would define this creature more carefully. And I would assume that, understanding the dogma of free will, and that we have the decision to make to choose to follow or not follow, to do good or not do good. It still seems kind of like a really weird parlor game to put somebody that's, very charismatic, strong, independent, and a leader, which is what we're told to look for in our lives and believe in, and then say that, well, this is, in fact, the Antichrist. This is the beginning of the end.
Right. Well, you covered a lot of ground with that comment. The Antichrist is something different. I believe it's, there's a technical term for it, but basically it's anybody who denies Christ and Christ came in the flesh, denies him as a historical figure. Now, Lucifer, Satan, is a positive deity, actually, and this is what people don't understand because they just listen to the propaganda from the pulpit and not actually go and read the ancient material themselves. I know when I was growing up, not many people actually read the Bible. They just believed what the priests wanted them to, and that unfortunately continues. Now, yeah, the whole idea of him being an evil deity comes from the fact that he's only that way in the perspective of he was the opposition to his half-brother, Yahweh. And we can get into why that is, but he basically went against Yahweh's wishes. And that's the only reason he's considered, quote-unquote, evil or bad or negative.
Right, and that's what I always found fascinating, because I have read the Bible and followed along in the different contextual references to it. And it always seems strange to me, and I know I'll get a lot of the religious sect that listens to our show up in arms about this, and I'm certainly not showing sympathy for the devil, but I'm trying to break it down to an understandable point where we should question what we're given. In the beginning, God is a vengeful spirit. God does the devil's work, it would seem. Right? He casts down, he separates, he causes division among his own people, he creates wars in a sense, and then, you don't abide by him, you're immediately cast out. And then we're given this broad stroke painting of God is this benevolent, all-loving, all-knowing, and forgiving entity. So forgiving that he's going to send his only true son, Jesus, down to earth to walk in our shoes and pay for the sins of all of us. But it seems like you cross him and there's no coming back. There's, there's no, it seems like retaliation is swift and usually unjust. And the tests that God gave to his people and his most beloved followers seems like completely messed up, right? Okay, hey, you're one of my greatest followers. I love you. Do me a favor, cut your son in half.
Right.
Right. What God does that? That is a curiosity to me. That aspect of this, and I've not been. And the reason I'm talking to a guest like Priscilla, ladies and gentlemen, is because when I do talk to a lot of religious leaders in the Catholic Church and the Lutheran religion and Methodist religions, they get stymied in these questions as well, and they don't have answers for me.
All right, well, I do have an answer for you.
Great.
Again, you covered a lot of things there. Now, let's go back to the garden for a minute. He said when he approached Eve, he says, I'm quoting from the Apocalypse of Moses, chapter 18, verse 1 to 2. He says, "May God live, for I am grieved over you that you are like animals, for I do not want you to be ignorant, but rise, come and eat, and observe the glory of the tree." So he was saving Adam and Eve, which were his prototypes, first successful prototypes, from a life of thraldom. He didn't want us to remain subservient to the authority of Yahweh. What Lucifer, Satan, did was question authority, stand against tyranny, and thought for himself. And this whole seeming conflict that you said, why does it seem that God is such a brutal autocrat? Well, he is. And it's just this appeal to authority everybody has. It continues to this day with government. There's a parallel right there here on Earth in the real world. People believe whatever the government tells them because it's an official source, or they don't question a scientific theory because science must be true. You got to think for yourself, and that's what Lucifer did, and that's why he's considered a negative deity, because when you go against authority, authority doesn't like it, and unfortunately there's more than enough people that will always fall in line no matter what. That's why we have the terms like sheeple and the masses. It's always going to be that way, unfortunately.
Right. And this character, this biblical character, was cast in a role, right? If it was all foretold and there were prophecies throughout the Bible telling of this being, this Lucifer, Satan, devil, whatever the topic is for him, it seems as though he was predestined, so free will had been removed from that. This is his role as an anarchist in history, to shake things up, to make things happen, and cause people to question and rise. How, when you're given the role and you do it well, how does that make you the bad guy? And again, it's a weird razor's edge we're walking right now, because I don't want to piss off half of my audience on this, but I want them to think for themselves that some of the ideology that we're given just doesn't make sense with the parable, the stories of what we're also told.
Right, and the fact that Satan even began questioning God tells you that angels are not automatons. They do have their own thought processes. It's just that he was the only one to exercise his own. He was the one that stepped out of line, And as the Chinese proverb goes, the nail that sticks out the most gets hammered down the first, right?
Right. I actually read, and part of why I found this topic interesting, because I'm a nerd, I love to read about the different TV shows I'm interested in, and I read this really interesting dissertation online. This person had written about The Walking Dead, and a character like Negan, who I'm not familiar if you keep up with the show, but how did this one man come to power over everyone else when they're all on the same playing ground? They all had this tragedy, they all had this, but one ruled with might and swift justice and took nothing from anybody. So his leadership is not so much earned, it is taken. And it almost seems to read like that is what the Bible is, that these angels, all of these beings that pre-existed history, were all on the same level. And, there's this Negan correlation where the one stepped up and said, listen, this is how it'll be. and this is how it needs to go. And everybody fell in line except for the Rick, right? You've got the Lucifer who says, well, wait a minute, this doesn't seem right. Why do we need to do this? We have these abilities. We have this skill set. Why are we not more in control of our own world and in our own destinies? And it's a very strange dynamic when you look at it, especially through the eyes of pop culture. And I know I'm boiling it down to, a very, in a sense, silly aspect, but you can, for the larger masses to swallow the pill to kind of see what we're talking about in this subject. That it seems like the God figure, at least in the Old Bible, is the Old Testament is definitely the darker character.
It is. He is, definitely. And it must be understood that God and Satan come from older Mesopotamian pantheons and the deities in those pantheons. And when you go all the way back to Sumer, which is pretty popular, we see that it comes down to two deities, Enlil and Enki, both sons of Anu, who was the head of the Sumerian pantheon. And Enlil is Yahweh and Enki is Satan. So that has to be understood. And it also, all the pantheons from Sumer all the way to Greece, all the way to Rome, they're all the same deities. They just have different names throughout the different cultures. And yes, there is a way to link them all together and identify them. And I do that quite a lot in my book. So that's the first thing that needs to be understood. And once you do that, you understand why these deities were in the positions of power that they were and why they did what they did. Now, Enlil was born of a goddess, and Enki was born of a mere concubine. So Enki was considered a bastard child. So that's why he was given second rank to Enlil, who was Yahweh. And that's why they are brothers. They're half-brothers, technically. And this concept goes back in monotheism all the way to Zoroastrianism, where Ormuzd and Ahriman are considered brothers as well. But monotheism is just taking polytheism and boiling it down to two dual concepts. It's kind of an illusion because of that. And also, all the deities are linked to each other through symbology, through etymology, through philology. So what this means is, obviously you have the two opposing perspectives, polytheism and monotheism, and monotheism is more of a symbolic concept of polytheism. So if you really want the answers to monotheistic questions, you have to research polytheistic texts. That makes sense.
Right, it does, but I guess, all right, when you're told this is the end-all be-all, this book, the Bible, this is the one that it all stems from, and then we can look into what's considered older texts. How do historians differentiate between this text's singular importance over another and relevance to history?
Yeah, that's the thing. No one text has authority over another. There's a process that I use called intertextuality, which is basically the process of taking one text, seeing that it has similarities to another, and linking it together in a mythographic way. What I did was piece together all of these different texts to make a coherent story, a full picture of what happened. And that's not easy to do. And it's extremely unpopular because religious segregation is usually the way people like it, unfortunately, but it's a mistake.
But what is the validation that the paperwork, the scrolls, the storylines that were told prior to the Bible have any significant relevance and are not just the whims of the Mark Twain of its time?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And the answer is not simple, unfortunately. And what separates blatant works of fiction like Mark Twain or Shakespeare or whatever and mythology is that mythology has an unknown origin. And other fictional works like Shakespeare has an origin. We know who the authors are. And in the Bible, we know who the authors are. But the older source material from which the Bible takes, from which it comes from and plagiarized from, we don't have an origin for these sources. We can say, yes, the Sumerians said this or that, or the Babylonians said this or that, but where they got that information is completely unknown. However, they did say that they experienced these things. The Sumerians said they experienced these things. They did not invent their myths staring at the sky. It's like Carl Jung said, the primitive does not invent myths, he experiences them. And that's where this came from. That's why euhemerism is important to consider.
And there is a long stretching narrative through different texts. I mean, how many different ancient texts and writings did you look at to pull together what you felt pretty cohesive narrative?
Well, I drew from all of the Mesopotamian sources, some Greek, some Mayan. I touched on Indian and Egyptian, but we really didn't. I didn't have to go any further out than that because the Bible, which was my focus, and the Quran, is rooted in the Mesopotamian sources.
Well, let's talk. I know in the book you cover the origins of religious mythology.
Yes.
Can you give us kind of a condensed version of that? What are the origins of this?
Well, our current academic paradigm states that mythology derives from what's called astrotheology, which is the worship of the heavens, the worship of the stars. And, you know, in a nutshell version, that's literally what it is. It's the primitives supposedly staring at the sky, using it as, say, a compass to know where they are during the night, and creating stories based on what they see in the sky. You know, that somehow makes sense to a lot of people, but there's no real historical basis of fact in that. When you look at the Sumerians and what they said, there's no real evidence for that. Now, later on in Babylonia, when they began astrological divination, that's when it became astrological. But originally it was not that way. There's actually no real evidence for astrological divination within the Sumerian culture. It was astronomical, and we can go back to the Mul Apin tablets for that. And that's provable. But the astrology of the Babylonians probably derived from the astronomy of the Mul Apin. That's my guess right now. But
the concept of a one God, of
yes,
one being over all,
right,
and you know, the creation and all of that follows in the Bible. I mean, there has to be, pardon the pun, but a genesis for all of that.
Right. And there is. And it's a paradox because the God of the Bible, the Quran, the Old and New Testaments, and the devil, Satan, call him what you want, they are amalgamations and conflations of all of the older Mesopotamian and surrounding cultures' deities, as I said, boiled down into a duality concept. So the idea of there being one God and one God only is fictitious, literally, because even in Psalms, we have a verse, I don't have it in front of me, but it basically says, God judges other gods in his court. So that explicitly states, hey, he has a pantheon too, he's just not acknowledging other deities.
All right. That's kind of an interesting twist on looking at it. storylines, and I mean, a lot of people aren't even really aware that there's, in the Bible, there's kind of a shakeup. There's the original creation, and then God kind of etch-a-sketches it all, right? Shakes it up and then reboots everything because he didn't like the way it was turning out. And then you've got the story of, we talked about Lilith on Tuesday's show when we talked about vampires. A lot of people, they think, and they're like, oh, somebody just added this nonsense later. But why are some of these original stories not carried over? They're in the older texts that are believed and followed by many of the older and longer-standing religions. But in Christianity, stories of Lilith and things like that don't even seem to enter our lexicon of history.
Well, Christianity has a very narrow view of all of this that has to be understood. And again, if you want to get to the answers of anything, you got to go beyond that. Now, Lilith was the first successful female created. And that was before Eve. And she wanted to be equal to Adam. It wasn't about sexual positions like the Jews say. It was about having equality with him, equal status. She was a feminist, the first one. And he didn't like that. Adam didn't want that because, Enlil Yahweh, he looks to the God that in charge, like people look to authority for the answers, and he says, hey, this is patriarchal, so, therefore the woman must be subservient to the man. And this idea is still carried on in our culture today, unfortunately. But, I'm sorry, what was the rest of your question?
Well, just kind of following the idea of why some of the storylines carry over and others don't. I know you said that Christianity took a more narrow slice. But knowing that, that's what I've always questioned too with religious leadership. If you know that we're not getting the whole story, and it is King James, I mean, there's no denying the fact that version is definitively different than the original texts that it came from, and things were altered, but yet we still look at it as though it is the rule and the one word of God, when we know that through time and history, people have manipulated and interpreted, reinterpreted, and put their own slant on the meanings of the concepts that are put forth in this book.
Yeah, and that's because the Roman Catholic Church said so. And the Church of England said so, and everybody, in a time where education was sparse, had to take the word of authority as truth. And, we live in a time where all the information in the world is available to us at any given moment. And yet people still look to the church and say, what do they say? Okay, I'll believe that. But we have to question this because it demands questioning. It's just an appeal to authority. That's what it boils down to. The Old Testament was, that was written about 1,000 years before the new one, and the new one, the books of the New Testament, was compiled by the Flavius dynasty of Rome. And that was a time when, Titus was having his campaign through Jerusalem, and the Jews were being oppressed, and they were calling out for a savior, someone to save them from Roman oppression. And lo and behold, the Roman aristocracy had something for them, and they gave them Jesus. Josephus and his team wrote they took the canonic Gospels from Marcion earlier in history, and shaped it into what the New Testament became. And so, therefore, the Jews had a savior that they actually rejected. Right. And rightfully so, because it was a fabrication.
We need to take a break. We're up against the bottom of the hour break. We'll take a quick break. We'll come back. What about the concepts of hell? Does this exist? Has it ever existed? Is it something that comes after the final revelations and the final war between the heavens and the earth? We'll talk about that with our guest. We'll also discuss some of the other cosmic beings. We'll talk about the whole theological nature of soul, spirit, and enlightenment. We'll do that in the next segment right here on Beyond the Darkness.
Today on Geffen Playhouse Unscripted, we are joined by actor, producer, director, author. What else can you do, Bryan Cranston?
I sweep floors.
You do?
And I load a dishwasher really, really well.
Do you unload it?
Not too many.
Okay. We could give you a job in our house.
The talent is loading it, not unloading.
No, the talent is buying the dishes that fit together and not the dishes that I buy that don't fit in the dishwasher.
Well, I could teach you how they can fit.
Okay, Bryan, thank you. That's Bryan Cranston on Geffen Playhouse Unscripted. Be sure to listen on Podcast One or through the Podcast One app and Apple Podcasts.
Mitch LaFon here. Please check out my new podcast, Rock Talk with Mitch LaFon, every Monday on the Jericho Network here at Podcast One. I'll be talking to all the biggest names in rock, including Andy Summers from The Police, Poison, Night Ranger, Loverboy, and a lot more. Download new episodes each Monday via PodcastOne.com, the Podcast One app, or simply subscribe via iTunes.
I admit it, TV's kind of my thing. I'll pretty much watch any crime show with an acronym in the title. I live for quirky 90s sitcoms, crazy nature documentaries, and even the occasional indie dramedy. All I need is my comfy pants, a classic movie, an all-new medical drama, or perhaps a little Tuesday night tearjerker. So give me a tense courtroom drama, mafia masterpiece, or even a quirky lead detective mismatched with a totally by-the-books partner, and I am in. And because I have wireless from AT&T, I get my favorite 60 channels of live TV for a year on them. So saying bye-bye, cable bill, is kind of my thing, too.
Get more from your wireless plan. Buy AT&T Wireless and get live TV on us. AT&T. More for your thing. That's our thing. Limited time New York Metro offer. Requires a new line on an eligible plan which starts at $75 per month and DirecTV Now $35 package. After 1 year, DirecTV Now renews at full price unless canceled. Eligibility and restrictions apply. See att.com/live TV on us for details.
Beyond the darkness.
We're back. This is Beyond the Darkness. I'm your host, Dave Schrader, and today we're talking with our guest, Priscilla Vogelbacher, and she has written a book called Hallowed Be Thy Name, Lucifer, Origins, and Revelation, talking about a different perspective on the theology we've all grown up with and understanding. Whether you are Christian in nature or not, it is forced down our throats in movies and TV and programming. Everybody around the world is familiar with the characters in the Christian pantheon and where they fit in. Is there a challenge to some of these? Do we find that in some cases the stories do not line up with the history? And what do we get from this? Well, our guest has done a considerable amount of research and looking into this. And again, she started from the beginning of the show explaining she has no skin in the game in this. She is an agnostic and doesn't really affiliate herself with any religion or religious organization. She's not a worshiper of Lucifer, Satan, or the devil, so she's not here to make that point. I know the listeners then would want to know, then why write a book? What are you trying to convey in this book for the reader?
Well, when I was beginning this research, like I said before, I wanted to know the answers to the biggest questions of life concerning these theologies. And the more I studied, the more it seemed to me very evident that Lucifer was the good guy in this story. And what really tipped me off was the Garden of Eden. But you mentioned hell before the break. Mm-hmm. And no, hell does not exist as a place of eternal damnation and punishment, as people believe. And in fact, the canonic Gospels do not state that, if you actually go and read it. Jesus, whenever he, in the canonic Gospels, mentions hell, whenever you see the word hell, it's actually the Hebrew word Gehenna. And what that is, it comes from Gehinnom, which was the valley of Hinnom, which was a valley that surrounded the old city of Jerusalem in his time. And that was accompanied with the valley of Kidron there as well. And within this valley of Hinnom, which was basically an ever-burning refuse heap People threw out their garbage, out dead bodies, etc. into this, and it was just a garbage dump. But within this valley was an altar, and it was called the altar of Topath, and sacrifices were made to the god Moloch and the god Baal. These are both Canaanite deities. Baal is equated with Yahweh and Enlil as one of the head of the pantheon, right below El, which is Anu. And Moloch has gained a reputation in conspiracy circles for its connection with the Illuminati, and therefore people equate it with the devil. But Moloch is not Satan. It's an aspect of Yahweh, not an aspect of Satan. His character was absorbed by Yahweh, and therefore similar to Baal. So what people did, and the Bible, the New Testament, actually states that people would sacrifice their children to Moloch and burn them alive.
Oof.
And so this is where the concept of hell comes from. People screaming, and this is why Jesus mentions the weeping and gnashing of teeth. This is, human sacrifices to these deities. That's where it comes from. There is no place of eternal torment where you go when you die. There's no real evidence for that.
Right, and from my understanding, even in reading the Bible, when he cast Lucifer down, he didn't cast Lucifer to hell. He cast him to have dominion over earth until the final reckoning, if you will. That's when there would be a parting of the ways, and those that were deemed worthy would go to be with God, and those that were not would be left with Satan or Lucifer. So that's always kind of been a part of the storyline as well, if I understand that. Exactly.
Satan was indeed given dominion over the earth. It's mentioned in a number of Gospels. He's referred to as the ruler of the world. He is referred to as the prince of the world. So, yes, earth is Satan's dominion. He is the god of earth. And it goes back to his Sumerian epithet Enki, his original form. Enki, the word means Lord Earth. He was the lord of the underworld, and as is Akkadian epithet Ea, the water god, lord of under the waters. So anything below the surface is his domain. He controls the earth. He is the god of the earth.
Right, and that seems to fly in the face of if you were a benevolent, loving God, why would you send forth your worst enemy to lord over the people that you love so much? And right. Created in your image and sent your son to do an ultimate sacrifice for.
Right, and the answer is because he actually was opposed to our creation. Enki was the one who created us, along with the goddess Ninursag, or Ninma, whatever epithet you prefer. And Enlil, Yahweh, he was opposed to it. The only reason he said, go ahead and create them, is because it goes back to the story of the Babylonian story of creation, the Enuma Elish, where the gods, faction of the gods called the Agigi, which were under Enlil's control, were a slave worker faction. They were mining in the Abzu, and the Abzu is not Southeast Africa, as Sichonites believe. It is literally the Nether Sea. That's what the word means. It was underwater. And being created in our image is not correct either, or us being created in God's image is not fully correct, because we are only created in the God's image, in that we are bipedal beings as well. When you look at the descriptions of the Mesopotamian sources, you come to see they were subaqueous, and they looked what we would consider demonic. So they were a underwater, underground dwelling demon creature. That's really what they were. And when you get to the most primordial source of a deity's form, it is indistinguishable from what people consider to be a demon. So this was a demonic race, using that term colloquially.
All right. Yeah. Well,
I know that's a lot. That's a lot to process.
It's a lot to process, right? Because, and again, how do you do this without shaking a lot of people who are very comfortable in their own paradigm? It's not like I'm saying, I'm giving up Christianity. It's just a load of crap. But I believe in challenging and questioning, much like you. I want to understand, why are these things being said? What, if anything, can back up or prove these statements and theories and concepts that have been put forth for us for thousands of years? Why are we leading our lives to believe one thing over another? And it's fascinating to me, people's belief systems and how they employ those belief systems, why they employ it. Most of it's because this is the way we're born. But there are people in other cultures who don't have our upbringing that also fall into this belief system that there is a great God, that there is one being over all. How do you attest for things like that?
Well, my argument is not about religion. I do not dabble with religion. I don't touch it. I know there's a lot of good things that come from religion. If you're religious, have at it. If it does you good, great. I have no opposition to that. My argument is with mythology. And my perspective is purely mythological. It's not religious, and that's what people need to understand. So when we say, Christianity is wrong, yeah, but, not the teachings. It's the stories. It's the gods themselves. The difference between mythology and religion is that mythology is, you pay attention to the gods, what they said, what they did, their actions, and religion is attention to the gods in a peripheral way, rites, rituals, evocations, etc. That's the difference. When you go to church and you pray to God, you're praying to an idea. You're not literally praying to a being that actually exists.
Are you saying it's, in your estimation, it's more of a focal point? It's a intention-setting device?
Yeah, and a prayer is literally no different in its form than casting a spell for a witch. If a Christian says a prayer to God, what they're doing is putting an energy, a thought, out to the ether in hopes that this concept reaches it. It reaches the concept. What a witch does is cast a spell, and what they're doing is the same thing. They're putting an energy into the universe to try to have a desired outcome. It's the same thing.
Right. And we talk a lot about that manifestation and intention here on the show, and how you need to, have a focal point and an idea and a belief system to create and become a lowercase God, but create lowercase g God in your own realm, right? We create that which we seek and which we go after.
Yeah, I make a very clear distinction between the creator of the universe, which I don't believe is a deity or an entity at all, but an energy, and that versus the God of, say, the Old Testament or the Quran is a very different concept. The creator of the universe, the way I understand it, is an energy. It's a neutral energy, and it has to be. And it has to be genderless as well, because once you leave Earth, gender might not even be a reality. We don't know. But to say something that came from nothing, has a gender, is an actual being like we are, is just nonsense. Now, if you read your Old Testament, and let's say the Eden story, it says God walked in the garden. And the Sumerians said God walked among them at one point. The Egyptians have a time called Zep Tepi, which is the mythic prehistory. And the gods walked with them too. This is a common thing that keeps coming up if you do your research. So there is a distinct difference between those two concepts, and we must not conflate them, because that's where the confusion is.
Okay, let's take a look at some of the other concepts that you cover in the book as well, and your belief systems. You talk about Zecharia Sitchin's Nibiru. What how does that tie into any of this? And for our listeners that aren't familiar, maybe you can give a little background on that as well.
Yeah, well, the Anunnaki has been very, very much a buzzword.
Right, hot button topic, right?
Yeah, it's been a point of interest for the past half century since he came out with this book, since Eric von Daniken started writing, and the whole ancient astronaut theory that goes along with it. But Nibiru is something Sitchin created of his own doing. What he does is create his own cosmological interpretation of the Enuma Elish. But Nibiru is only mentioned twice. If you go back to the translations and read them as they are, it's only mentioned twice. And once is a reference to Jupiter, the planet Jupiter, and the other is a reference to our sun. Where he got a planet that orbits in an elliptical way every 3,600 years, the number 3,600 is a Sumerian unit of measurement. That's really all it is, and that's where he got that number. Let me bring this up. Yeah, 3,600 is called a sar. Now, what you do is you multiply 6 by 10, and 6 is the different body parts, multiplied by 10, which is the 10 fingers on both hands or the 10 toes on each foot, and you get 60, which is sauce. It's called sauce. You multiply 60 by 10 again, because you have 2 hands and 2 toes. You get 600, called Nur, and you multiply 600 by 6, and you get 3,600, which is called a sar. So that's where the number comes from. It does not come from Nibiru itself. And if you pick up a copy of the 12th planet and you go to his bibliography and see what sources he uses the English translations. That's what he cites. And these are the exact same translations I use in my book too. And after studying it for years, I see no legitimate evidence to suggest that the Sumerians ever mention a planet named Nibiru in the way that he described. It was a fabrication.
Is it funny to you how people will take a nugget that they're given and run with it as truth? Because
all the time.
It's somebody of who they believe to be import sharing this knowledge?
Yeah, it's all the time that happens, unfortunately. Another common misconception that I'd like to bring up is the Nephilim. People equate the Nephilim with the gods, with the Anunnaki, or with the fallen angels, none of which is true at all. None of which has any basis in reality. What the Nephilim was a tribe of giants. There were other tribes there too, like the Ivim, the Geberim, or the Zamzumim, the Rephaim. They were a tribe. There were many tribes. What the Nephilim, why they are so important, is because they were a particularly nasty tribe. And yes, they ate people. That's why they gained the reputation they did. They were not the fallen angels. They were not the Anunnaki. They were not the gods. The giants were the offspring of the fallen angels with humans. And that's stated in various texts, notably the Ethiopian Kebra Nagas. It states explicitly when these creatures were born, they were so large that they all had premature births, and they just burst forth from the mother's stomachs, just ripped open. It's pretty gruesome.
Yeah, you think?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Chilling, weird stuff, right, when you're digging this kind of information out. Were there any parts of the texts that you went through that actually surprised you or seemed to have put you on a new perspective for something maybe you were even going in skeptical of?
That's a good question. I don't think so, because what I did was followed the evidence and let it take me where it did. I didn't have a preconceived notion that I tried to fit things into. I just let it become what it became, because I was open to any possibility. I didn't know the full story. That's why I did this. That's one of the reasons why I did this. And that's one of the reasons why I continue to do this. There's a lot of unanswered questions at the end of this book, and I'm still looking for the answers.
What compels you most about all of this? I mean, you certainly don't really kind of prescribe to any one, or subscribe rather to any one belief system, but do you have a belief in what happens, where we go, what this is all about?
Yeah, of course. What compels me the most is the real possibility that mythology is a written record of our prehistory. That's what it's about. That's what euhemerism is, and that's what pushes me on. The possibility that we may not have been, evolved from apes or alongside apes, as science is telling us. These texts could have been a real written record of things that really did happen, and then you have to ask, well, why the cover-up, and I don't have an answer to that just yet, but maybe one day I will.
In the research and trying to bring comfort to people regarding a lot of the stigma of good versus evil, our place, it's a pretty reliable tool, hell and the devil, to keep people in check, right?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, it's definitely been a fail-safe. Yeah. That's
you bring about different aspects of this. How do people react to you when you're, sharing your truth on these subjects?
Dumbfounded silence has been the consensus response so far.
And do you think that's because, and I'm one of these, I've read the Bible, and could I say I'm super well versed? No, I mean, I went to Lutheran grade school, I read the Bible numerous times growing up, I read it once or twice as an adult, even the audible version of the Bible, in case I was missing something. The concepts are, though, sometimes so great and so muddled that to even debate some of these facts, I feel like I'm left stupefied and kind of silent, because it's like, I can see both sides of this story. I can see both angles of this, and it makes you question what you thought you knew. And which, again, according to Christianity, that's exactly what the devil's job is, right? To confuse us, confound us, and make us question God and his authority over us.
Right.
I think a lot of the reason people are so silent about it is as much as we'd like to debate some of the facts, we're still not even really all that aware of what the facts are that have been laid out in front of us for centuries.
Yeah, that's one of the things my book clears up. It's like Nietzsche said. He said people don't like to hear the truth because they don't like their paradigms altered. They don't like their perspectives shattered. And that's what this does. That's what facts do. That's just the nature of truth. That's sola theology. Can't get around it. People always like to say, note the adage, truth is stranger than fiction, but when it comes to things like this, nobody wants to take that on.
What do you think when we look at things like UFOs and ancient aliens, these beings that seem to be extraterrestrial in nature? Do you believe that they do play a role in this whole narrative? Or is it something that is also just misunderstood, mistaken, and misidentified?
No. Yeah, that's not the way I look at the ancient astronaut theory, which is actually what the ancient alien thing is. It's not real mythology because you're not taking myth on its own terms. What they're doing is taking mythology and trying to fit it into a framework of ufology with a loose shell of scientism. That's my take on it. I love the theory, the show is, it's entertaining, but there's not a lot of truth in it. Not a lot of mythological truth, that is.
we've got very little time left together, about 7 to 8 minutes here. Looking at the concepts overall, what do you think that even, after you've gotten through this, are there some concepts that you have reevaluated, you've gone back to see, did I misinterpret, did I misunderstand this? And if so, what were some of the changes that you've even seen in your concept of beliefs?
I'm still in that process, and that's a part of the second book that I'm writing. There's things that need to be considered that accompany what I've already written. I didn't want to write a book that was 1,500 pages, because who would read that? And so I am still looking for the answers. Like I said before, you have to understand the difference between an esoteric interpretation and an exoteric interpretation. Mm-hmm. And when you are trying to identify a deity in different contexts, like for instance NQ is Satan, he's also Kronos in a sense, because that's for the second book. But Kronos could also be Anu, depending on the context of the narrative. So context is a very big key to follow as well. There's unfortunately not one answer standard for the entire thing. And that's because if you consider myth as a record of prehistory, you understand that, you're writing down something from memory, not as it happens. There's no empirical scientific data to accompany this. It's a memory of what was. So of course some things are going to be misinterpreted or left out, or some details will be found in one culture and other details will be found in another. And it's a lot of work to try to piece it all together, but it can be done.
What do you think is going on, and what can account for these near-death experiences people have, where they claim to be in the light of a being, God or Jesus? What do you think that experience is then that they are having?
Yeah, that's really open. For one, I don't claim to have the answer to anybody's personal experience, because I am not the one having that experience. However, if somebody does encounter a being of light, that doesn't necessarily mean it's God or Jesus. It could be, it could be an angel. It could be a demon. It could be an entity that actually has a different way of existing in the universe than we do. It could be a real entity. It could be a figment of the imagination. It's very open to interpretation. And, unfortunately, there's not a lot of work being done about the afterlife in a scientific way to make any stern judgment on what any of that is.
I'm so curious by those aspects, because there are people that are, like you, agnostic. They don't subscribe to really any one belief system, and in some cases, it's completely atheistic, yet they still have these godlike moments where they encounter a being, a powerful being, and some have even encountered hell.
Yeah, well, there's also a perspective that is really compelling, and that is, you encounter after death what you expect to. And that means you create what it is you go through, which is really interesting to me. It's definitely something to consider. So, and we have the...
So you're saying that when we die, the concept of our soul, we've created whatever heaven or hell waits for us.
Maybe. I'm saying it's a possibility. The concept of heaven, the way I believe it, is simply the place where we go to when we die, from which we came, thus we then return. It's just another realm of existence. We leave our body, we are, energy, and like a drop of water becomes the ocean, we become a part of that realm. That's what I believe.
Oh,
and therefore
part of a collective.
Yeah, and you become God. and God becomes you. You are a part of that, you know.
Cuckoo, cuckoo, and I am the walrus, right? It all comes together. Fascinating aspects on this, Priscilla. I'm always intrigued to talk to people that are willing to shake up paradigms. And even in a case like this, the 2,000-year-old belief that we've had in our current religious status, I think it's okay. And, you know, I've actually sat and off-air talked with Tim about the fact that it's very Twilight Zone, that there are cases where I wonder, you know, did the devil just have a worse PR group? You know, did Lucifer just, you know, he wasn't, he didn't have the dream team that OJ had. He had a different aspect, or maybe wasn't working as hard to try to convince people, which again makes you question when people go out of their way to try to make you believe they're the best. Usually they're hiding something, or usually there's a massive flaw in that system.
Mm-hmm. Well, like I said, Anu was the oversight of the Pantheon, and he gave supreme authority to his son Enlil, and Enki stood against him, and he was ostracized. That's actually what the rebellion is all about. It was Enki, Satan, being ostracized from the Pantheon, and that's why he is in opposition.
All right. Well, we wish you a lot of success. How can people find the book?
The book is on Amazon, Amazon.com. It's also available in Canada and the UK and Europe. Whatever you go through, you can find it there. Or you can go to my website, beautifulnightmarestudios.com. That's one word. Or you can just look me up on Google, and it'll all pop up right on the front page.
And if you want to get it through Amazon.com, make sure you visit darknessradio.com and click on our Killer Deals link. You'll find the Amazon links there, as we are part of their affiliate program. Any purchase you make using those links in Canada, the United States, or the UK, a very small portion of those sales goes a long way to help us defray the costs of keeping the show on the air and as ad-free as we possibly can. That's it for today. Tomorrow, Freaky Florida on a Freaky Friday, we'll talk about the cryptids